sudden, the weapons, they're doing something. Oh, what are they doing? I already told you, something. You don't know? Well, I was hoping that you'd tell me. But isn't that your job? Ladies, gentlemen, and monsters of all ages, a few days ago we had the release of Title Update 2 for Monster Hunter Wilds, and along with this we also had an update into patch 1.02. This contains a surprisingly large amount of balance changes for a number of the weapons, and not even just numerical changes, but a few of them have had some pretty major mechanical overhauls or even full-on shifts, and in classic Monster Hunter fashion, we were told what was changing in a more general, sort of vague sense, but without any proper numbers. And so today, we're going to go over my testing and comparisons of all of the weapon changes in Title Update 2, both mechanical and numerical. Before we start then, pretty much all of my footage for comparison pre-Title Update stuff is going to be a bit low quality and definitely a touch laggy, and I apologize for that, but between the time they announced the weapon changes and the time of patch release, I only had access to my laptop, so it will be a bit choppy at points because of that, but the actual numbers and stuff like that are going to be completely unaffected by that. That said, there were 9 weapons with entries in the patch notes saying that they had changes, so let's go over every note that was listed and say what it actually did. Starting off with Longsword, the first line is elemental scaling for Crimson/2 has been significantly increased. Using the exact same setup pre and post patch, the damage of the first hit is increased by around 30%, the damage of the second hit by around 27%, so let's call it an average 28% increase in damage from this change for this input as a whole. And this is all in elemental scaling, so the more you lean into element, the larger a result you will see from this in your combat. The second line then is raw damage and elemental ailment scaling from Crimson/3 has been increased. In the same setup pre and post patch, the first hit's damage goes up by 13%, the second by 21%, and the third by 15%. So let's call that an average of 16% increase for this attack across the board with a raw focused weapon that has some element on it. The third change for Longsword is Crimson/3 now chains faster into Spirit Blade 1 as a combo. Here they are next to each other for direct comparison, how it was before and how it is now. It is around a third of a second faster now than it was previously, which is a pretty substantial amount when we're talking about trying to find room and time to do specific combos, or trying to make longer combos more viable and more valuable than shorter combos. Change number 4 for the longest of swords, Spirit Release / raw damage slightly increased. This is the attack that you can use as a follow-up to the Helmbreaker. It has a bunch of different motion values through the slice, but the lowest damage number has gone up by a whopping 80%, and the highest damage number has gone up by around 20%. So slightly increased seems like a strange wording to me, because this attack has actually been significantly boosted compared to what it was before, if you consider that the low ticks have been increased that massively as well. Fifth and sixth changes then we will do together as they're part of a combo. Spirit Round Slash in red gauge, raw damage increased, and Spinning Crimson Slash, raw damage increased. These both seem to have gone up by around 1.5% to 2% in pure raw, which is an extremely tiny amount. Honestly, it's really sort of odd to see that they thought it was off, but only by this minor an amount and still decided to fix it. Then another quite small one, we have EI Spirit Slash, raw damage increased when Spirit Gauge is in white or yellow. This has gone up by right around 2%. Not anything crazy, but it's still nice, nothing to complain about there. Then finally, one of the only real nerfs in any of the weapon changes, which is element and ailment scaling for Crimson/1, has been decreased. This has brought the damage down by around 5%, so it's not too major, but they are clearly trying to push Longsword away from just using Crimson/1 and 2 as a main combo, and into using much longer, riskier combos as a whole. Moving on, we've got the changes for Sword and Shield. First change, Shield Attack, Shield Bash, and Hard Bash, raw damage and stun values slightly increased, so the full Shield combo. Shield Attack has gone up in damage by 23%, Shield Bash has gone up by 10%, and then Hard Bash up by a massive 27%. So basically they are trying to punish you a bit less for doing an accidental Shield Bash you don't mean to, and when you're trying to do like a lateral slash and you happen to be moving, and then trying to make the full Shield combo more rewarding by making the end of the combo do a good chunk more damage. That said, the main use of the Shield combo is for stun value, and they did say they also increased the stun value, which is great, but that is much harder to quantify without data mining, which hasn't happened yet. Second change, Perfect Rush's finishing portion has had its raw damage slightly increased. This is specifically the Shield Bash attack within the Perfect Rush combo, and it has gone up by 10% damage, which isn't bad at all and does help make Perfect Rush more valuable as a whole. Next up, a pretty hefty hit for SNS, a bit of a nerf, nerf, so we'll tackle 2 changes with this. First, they adjusted it to make it harder to consecutively chain the guard/move into itself. And then also, counter/damage has been decreased. This was one of the sort of cheat codes on Sword and Shield and Wild so far. You could spam guard/ over and over, and like 90% of the time, and if an attack connected with you, it would be during a perfect guard window, because guard/ resets the perfect guard window. And because of how that works and how that interaction is, that made it really strong. Now, however, it is far less reliable. I put them side by side on the screen so you can see the speed difference, but it simply just chains way slower as an attack, and so there is far less incentive to just spam this when you're in danger. When counting the frames from the first damage number pop-up until the second one, in other words, the time between guard/1 and guard/2, it goes from 17 frames before the patch to 28 frames after the patch, which is literally 65% longer recovery frames between each guard/ that you do. So you can tell they really didn't like that people were spamming this as a playstyle. As well, the counter/, which is the follow-up to a perfect guard, has had its raw damage decreased by 20%, which is a super hefty amount, honestly. Clearly they want people to focus less on a guard and counter playstyle with Sword and Shield, which is sad to me as that was fun to have as an option, and it wasn't really breaking the game offensively, or at least it wouldn't have been with the guard/ changes they've already done here too. Moving on, slightly decreased invulnerability window for sliding swipe, and this is quite a noticeable drop. Using paratoads to test the difference here, before the patch you could just slide fully through a paratoad cloud with this attack. The frames were so long that the entire animation was fully protected until you start to stand back up. After the patch, the second that your shoulder droops forward while you're sliding, you are like bracing to stop the slide, that's when you lose the iframes. This is about a third of a second of a difference at minimum, as this used to be nearly a full second of iframes before the patch, and now is definitely a good chunk less. Finally, for Sword and Shield, we have raw damage slightly decreased for chop and side slash, which are the first 2 hits of the moving standard attack combo. This is a first 2 hits of the standard attack combo. This is a 6% decrease in damage for chop, which is the first input, and a 5.5% decrease for side slash, the second input. This is trying to, again, incentivize longer, riskier combos being used, rather than having high damage available in the first couple of hits and lower damage later on. Our next weapon then is going to be dual blades, which saw some pretty substantial shifts in this patch. First up, you can now change your direction when entering demon mode right after a dodge. Before the patch, you were sort of locked rigidly into a very specific animation, where if you did this, you couldn't turn and change direction until your blades were up in the air. Whereas now, you can be turning as soon as you are out of the evade and still be activating demon mode. So it's just a really nice quality of life change for that specific niche situation. A slightly more substantial mechanical change while in demon boost mode, which is what activates after you do the perfect dodge iframe spiral. If you dodge and then hit the Blade Dance inputs, you will now skip to Blade Dance 2, fully passing over Blade Dance 1. This is the weakest part of the combo, so it's nice to not have to use it, because it allows you to reach the heavier hits faster and with less cost of your actual demon gauge. The next change then is movement speed during demon mode has been increased, and it seems to be around 5 to 6% faster than it used to be, which is to say that demon mode movement speed is now around 25% faster than base movement speed. Then we get to simpler number-based stuff. Basic moves like 6-fold Demon Slash, Demon Flurry Rush, and stuff like that have had their raw damage increased. This is, for the most part, seeming to increase the damage of the earlier attacks and combos that aren't Blade Dance to try and just make the general moment-to-moment output a bit higher. Some of the hits have been raised by up to 30%, some haven't been touched at all, but this is basically just making the Demon Fangs and multi-fold Demon Slash combos better in general, as well as the Demon Flurries too. Then we have a couple of changes that go hand in hand. Screw Slicer, raw damage, element, and ailment scaling greatly increased, as well as the raw damage boost from Demon Boost mode being slightly decreased, but elemental scaling and boost increased. These changes will essentially always be active together because of how it works, so we can't talk about them separately. The overall result for Screw Slicer is that the first hits, the low numbers, actually go down a little bit if you're using just pure raw weapons, but the bigger numbers at the end of the animation go up by nearly 50%, which is not bad at all. So essentially they are moving the power of Demon Boost to be much more towards using Screw Slicer itself, and especially if you are using Element Dual Blades, which makes sense as most people probably should be using Element Dual Blades in most situations. Focus Strike raw damage increased as well, and specifically the part of this that is increased is right as you are pushing off of the monster before going into the Beyblade, you do 3 pops of identical numbers of damage. Before the patch, this was around 10.5 with a 100 attack weapon and no buffs. After the patch, it is up to 28.4. So those specific hits of the attack are now 2.7 times the damage that they were before the patch. And while the attack that is pretty long, it has way more hits than that, it is still a pretty noticeable increase to the attack's damage as a whole. Then Heavenly Blade Dance raw damage has been increased. Specifically, this refers to the final 2 hits of Heavenly Blade Dance Finisher, the attack that you do as you land from doing a Beyblade from a ledge. These 2 hits have been exactly doubled in damage, making it much more valuable to play around ledges if they are actually in a zone that you're fighting in. Blade Dance elemental scaling and ailment scaling have been slightly decreased, but the raw damage scaling is now around 4% higher. This just about makes up for the loss of raw damage bonus from Demon Boost mode, but also the increase in elemental scaling from Demon Boost mode. It basically just made Blade Dance more or less evened out regardless of these changes, and it also makes you less reliant on the uptime of Demon Boost. After that, we have my personal main weapon, the hammer, which has had the straight up largest changes to any weapon that I have ever seen happen in an active Monster Hunter game, unless you count like full-on expansions. It's an absolutely massive transformation to the moment-to-moment gameplay. First up, you now have a follow-up attack after an offset, which everyone was always asking for, but only if it gets the proper stagger, as opposed to the usual offset follow-ups. This attack is a pretty hefty maneuver. It pulls you towards the monster at the very beginning, and then you start spinning. You can spin up to 4 times before it automatically ends with a small hit, or if you press the attack button earlier than that, you get follow-up Spin Slam, which is an attack that does nearly as much damage as Mighty Charge Slam and uses a very familiar animation being very similar to Impact Crater from Sunbreak. Importantly, this can also then be comboed and chained into Mighty Charge after the fact, so it's actually really incredibly unbelievably strong and should be leaned into heavily when playing Hammer now. On which note, you can now chain Focus Blow Earthquake into Charge Psyblow, which is pretty nice, but there are now 2 more attacks for the weapon that count as offsets, and that is beautiful. Attacks that were already part of the moveset before, but now have gained the offset effect, and one of them is one that I've always said should have it. These are the Charged Upswing, the level 2 charge attack, and also Mighty Charge Upswing, which is the level 1 charge of Mighty Swing. So now we have this absolutely nutty thing that we can do, where the Gulf Swing combo ends with Upswing, which is our original offset attack, and then you can start Mighty Charge, and if you release that immediately, if you release it early, it will be Mighty Charge Upswing, which is now also an offset. So you have a combo where there can be 2 offsets back to back if necessary, and if not, you can just go into Mighty Charge Slam. Not to mention that if you do an offset, you can follow that with the offset follow-up into Mighty Charge Slam, which is our highest damage move. Another really solid change that fits right in with these offset additions is that now if you use the charge step after an evade, it almost immediately brings you to level 2 charge. So you can do a charged upswing, which again is now an offset, giving you really easy access to an offset, not only while staying mobile, but also letting you use iframes during the charge up period too, because you dodge and then do charge step as you're charging. Then just a nice damage increase to round things off. Mighty Charge Slam raw damage and elemental scaling has been increased, and this seems to be around 5% more damage, and it also makes this really satisfying thing happen where the first 2 hits of Mighty Charge Slam are exactly 10% each of the damage of the final hit. Next up then we have Hunting Horn, another of my personal main weapons, and another weapon with some fun mechanical additions. Now, if you play the Focus Strike notes with perfect timing, you get a 6th note of your choice at the end, which you can control with extra note inputs. But this just moves the attack from being 5 notes played into 6, which allows more melody generation when there is a wound to pop for Hunting Horn, and importantly also makes it do even more damage when reverberating through echo bubbles. As well, if you do this perfect timing, you will also create a free bonus echo bubble, meaning that it does not consume one of your echo bubble charges when you do this, which is actually a really useful new mechanic for the Focus Strike that makes it easier to keep echo bubbles up around more agile monsters. The Seikret no longer stops your moving when you are performing while mounted, and that is a simple but effective change, as beforehand it would just pause you and make you not be able to move until you were done. The damage hitbox itself of the echo bubbles has increased, not the damage, but the radius on the reverberation, and now should be much closer to matching the actual circle of the echo bubble, which before it didn't quite. Then a final change of note is that resounding melody will now properly aftershock through a monster if they are hit by any part of the attack rather than only by the final hit, which it was how it worked before. Then after that, we've got just a couple of changes for Lance. Nothing really test-worthy here, but just so you know what happened, you can now chain Charge Counter from Focus Strike, which is a nice but small change, and they also made the hitbox of the Focus Strike itself a little bit larger, so it's easier to actually hit wounds with it. Following that, though, we have quite a significant list of changes for Switch Axe. Starting off for Testables, the elemental scaling of file explosions with element files after amped sword attacks has been increased by around 20%. Then for specifically Unbridled Slash, full release slash, and axe follow-up morph slash, they have increased the element file damage by around 5%. This is clearly to try and incentivize less just pure full release slash spam as a playstyle for elements specifically for this weapon. Next up, both of the offset follow-up attack options have been buffed. For the axe heavy slam follow-up, this is a 60% buff to the first hit and a 20% buff to the second hit. For the morph slash follow-up, this is a 2.5% increase on the main slash, but the file explosion has also been boosted by a whopping 85%. So this is actually quite a decent offset follow-up bit of damage now. They've also increased switch gauge recovered on basic axe mode attacks, but this doesn't feel all that noticeable for power files at least. Axe morph rising double slash raw damage also has increased gauge generation, on top of also gaining a massive damage boost, being now 3.5 times the previous damage for the first hit and 3.8 times the previous damage for the second hit. This significantly benefits a full release slash focused playstyle for raw, as you can loop full release slash into spiral burst slash, into axe morph rising double slash, back into full release slash, and barely lose any switch gauge at all within that loop. Then the same treatment has been given to sword triple slash, again with also substantial damage increases. The first hit is now 4.6 times the old damage, the second hit is 2.8 times the previous version, the third hit is 2.7 times the previous one, and then even the file explosion at the end of this attack is also 3.3 times the damage of the original attack was before this too, making this attack as a whole way better than it used to be, and honestly making me question what the heck it was doing before being that much weaker. And then they've also just lowered the switch gauge cost of sword overhead slash, the opening triangle move in sword mode, to try and sort of incentivize more combos that are not just spamming full release slash. Next up, we've got the charge blade and another list of solid significant changes. Guard points now have perfect guard effects, and that means that you can chain out of them into savage axe slash to enter power axe mode. Previously, you had to either do a normal perfect guard or a focus strike to access this, so it is quite a nice change. Impact file damage for SAED has been increased by around 40%, which is hopefully going to be enough to make super amped element discharge a more viable playstyle once more, especially in combination with some changes that are going to be happening for power axe mode's raw damage coming up in a moment. Weak slash, return stroke, and then shield thrust as sword mode attacks have had their raw damage increased, being right around a 20% increase for each one of those attacks. Sword boost mode impact file damage has been supposedly increased, but in my testing it seemingly did the exact same damage that it did before, unless I just misunderstood what that patch note meant. But then they've also had a couple of double-edged sword sort of changes for axe mode as well. Now you can chain quicker out of element discharge into moves like axe dash slam, which did used to be like the meta combo, except for now, power axe has also been nerfed. Specifically, the multi-hit saw blade effect has had its damage reduced by around 40%, so an absolutely massive nerf for power axe playstyle for specifically raw damage charge blade, which seemingly indicates that they want people to use power axe in the saw blade mode for element charge blade, and a more SAED focused playstyle for impact file charge blades instead, which I think is honestly a pretty reasonable way to try splitting the weapon up a bit, rather than just having one playstyle fully dominate everything. Then our final weapon with changes is heavy bowgun, but they are quite short and sweet and simple, getting increased ignition gauge recovery for spread ammo 1 and 2, but not spread ammo 3, and spread 3 is what you'll generally be using if you want to use spread ammo anyway, so that's a bit odd, but then just a couple of bug fixes and that's it. All of the weapon changes in patch 1.02, the title update to patch dived into, tested, and then explained. I hope you've all enjoyed this, and hopefully it helps you out in working out how you may or may not want to change your playstyle with your weapon of choice moving forwards. Let me know how you feel about having changes this radical happen post-release in the comments, as this is by far the largest shift in weapon balance that we've had in a title update in the history of title updates existing in Monster Hunter. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet. Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.